A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I heard from my colleagues that there are some of you joining us from all across the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night for those of you who are joining us in different time zones. But for those of you who are in the room with me, good evening. Welcome to the Head Foundation Dialogues. My name is Vignesh. I'm part of the Head Foundation team. And today we're really excited to be able to continue on a series that we started last month, exploring the issues around pain management. Why do you feel pain? I think many of us in different stages of our life, every day, pain is something that we think about, that we encounter, that we deal with. I've been trying to go to the gym a bit more often, so getting out of bed is very painful sometimes. But why? Why pain? Why do we feel pain? What is it about pain? Is pain medical? Is it psychological? What's the physiological effect? So I think we are quite keen to try to better understand this. It's an issue that plagues many of us all across the world. And it's something that we want to try to understand better from different perspectives, the medical perspective, the psychological perspective, the physiological, the social perspective of pain. And today, we're really honored to have joining us Dr. Stuart Derbyshire from the National University of Singapore. He's an associate professor at the Psychology Department in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science, and he also has a concurrent appointment at the NUS College. And today, he's going to be talking about rethinking pain, physiology, and psychology. I hope that this session will be an opportunity for us to better understand the work that Dr. Stuart has been doing for the last couple of years, trying to help us better understand pain, why we feel pain, what does it mean to feel pain, and what does pain mean when you are a human? So I hope that today we have the opportunity to learn. I would please ask those of you in the room, kindly turn your handphones and your mobile devices to silent mode. Do participate and engage actively in the conversations today. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the question and answer box. Do ask your questions, do share with us your perspectives, which I will turn to and refer to during the Q&A session. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stuart to share his perspectives in rethinking pain, physiology, and psychology. Dr. Stuart, please.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about pain. The talk I'm going to give is based on a course that I run at NUS College. The course is 13 weeks. We meet twice a week for a couple of hours, so 50 hours of lectures. I'm condensing that down into 1 hour tonight. It's a little insane, but we'll see how we get on. All right, so what I'll talk about is the biology of pain, the peripheral receptors and the brain. That's actually the most straightforward part of the talk. It's the shortest part of the talk. It's the easiest part of the talk. Not because the physiology and the brain are easy, but because I can easily simplify it. Then we'll talk about the psychology of pain. Pain varies according to how we are thinking and how we are feeling, which starts to complicate things. And then finally, the bulk of what I want to talk about tonight is how both biology and psychology have failed in accounting for the rising global burden of chronic pain. Okay, so if you've ever thought about pain at all in your life, and I assume you must have done because you've come here, then this is probably the kind of model that you will have spontaneously generated in your head. Pain is that thing that starts when you have a noxious peripheral event. So you prick your finger with a needle, and that will activate receptors in your skin that are specialized to detect threatening stimuli to tissue. That will cause activation in nerve fibers, which in turn will cause activation in a part or parts of the brain that will ring out pain. This is called specificity theory. It's a very old theory. It's about at least 400 years old. It was first proposed by René Descartes in the 1600s. And this is the diagram, the sketch that Descartes produced to illustrate the theory. And you'll see that it's not a million miles away from the model that you might have in your head. The boy is sat with his foot frighteningly close to the fire, and Descartes says that particles of the fire open up pores in the skin and cause activation to ascend to the brain. Now, I normally ask my audiences at this point, do you notice anything about this illustration? It's a slight trick question, so I'll let you off the hook. I won't make you answer this one. I'm going to make you answer the next question, though, so get ready. Many people will say, well, the boy doesn't look particularly like he's in much pain. That is true, but maybe Descartes just wasn't a very good sketch artist. You can't be good at everything, right? Many people will also point out that the boy is entirely naked. Yes, he is. I assume that's just to make it easier to see what's going on in the boy's body. No other particular reason for that. But actually, what I do want you to notice is blindingly obvious, which is the boy is sat all alone. You might think, well, why the heck does that matter? It matters because what Descartes is implying with having the boy all alone is that everything that's important about pain takes part within the confines of your body. So yes, the boy is entirely by himself, and that implies that all the phenomena relevant to understanding the experience of pain occur within the boundaries of the body. Nothing else particularly matters is what Descartes is implying with that. Okay, so now the body definitely matters. No body, you don't feel anything at all. And you need nociceptors, those are specialized receptors in the skin to detect noxious injury, to feel pain at all. There are a variety of different so-called nociceptors, specialized receptors, in the skin for the experience of pain. Some that respond to strong heat, some that respond to chemical irritation, some that respond to strong pressure, and some that respond to strong cold. Those are the beginnings of an experience of pain. If you're born without functional nociceptors, you will never feel pain from a physical stimulus. Okay, so that might sound good, right? A pain-free life. But this time you do have to answer, why is that a really bad thing? Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Without these nociceptors, you don't have the protective function of pain. There are a small number of people who are born congenitally insensitive to pain because their nociceptors don't work. They typically don't live very long. They suffer horrendous injuries. It's a good example that you used. The example that I always use is a lady was preparing the family meal. She's making a casserole. The casserole's in the oven. She's rushed all of a sudden. She reaches into the oven, pulls the casserole out, puts it on the family table. The table erupts in flames. Her hands are completely destroyed, but she didn't feel it. So that's the kind of thing that will happen if you don't have functional nociceptors. So that's clearly bad. Pain has a protective function. It's necessary to live a normal life. So the nociceptors begin the story. The nociceptors give rise to activity in a nerve fiber that projects into the spinal cord. Then a second nerve projects into the thalamus in the brain. And then a third nerve projects out to the various different parts of the cortex in the brain, the rippled bit that's on the outside. About 40 years ago, we started investigating pain using functional imaging technology that allows us to see the living brain in action. And at that time, it was thought that maybe there'd be one area of the brain that was a pain center similar to visual centers, auditory centers in the brain. Turns out that's incorrect. There are lots of different parts of the brain that are involved in pain. So here is a diagram, a cartoon showing all the different studies that have been published on pain. Each dot is a different study. There's a cluster of dots you can see here in the thalamus. That's the sort of gateway of all sensory information coming into the brain. There's a cluster of dots here in the anterior cingulate cortex. That's thought to process the unpleasant component of pain and maybe also the attentional component of pain. There's a cluster of dots here in primary sensory cortex. There's a map of your body in primary sensory cortex. Each piece represents a different part of the body. Most studies use the hand. So this is a cluster in the hand area that tells you where in your body you're being injured. If you come down, you hit secondary somatosensory cortex. That's thought to process some of the qualitative aspects of pain, cold versus burning, throbbing versus pricking, and so forth. Here, there's a cluster in the prefrontal cortex. That's thought to be where beliefs and organization of behavior take place. And then finally, in the anterior insula down here, also where there's an unpleasantness of pain, that particularly if the pain is sickening, you tend to get activation there. And there, the story might end. There's a lot of detail to still work out, but pain begins in the periphery with the nociceptors. They encode stimuli in the noxious range, intense heat, intense cold, pressure, and so forth. And then the brain untangles that activity to generate the sensory, the affective, and the cognitive experience of pain. And now and it's a lot, but all that's left is for scientists to work out the details and develop improved pain therapies, target drugs at these different areas, target behavioral programs at these different areas, and resolve the problem of chronic pain that doesn't perform an obvious protective function. Okay, well, if it was that simple, I wouldn't be stood here talking to you. I'd just be working in a lab and it wouldn't be that interesting. There are lots of complications that make that simple story not the case. And it begins with Henry Beecher. Henry Beecher was an anesthesiologist in the 1940s. Here he is in his civilian setting in his hospital in Boston. And here he is in France during the Second World War, where he was helping out with the war effort for the Americans. And what Beecher noted as he was working in the hospital tents of France was that as soldiers came in with injuries that he was, used to seeing from car accidents and work accidents back at home, the soldiers would report far less pain than he was used to seeing. And they would also ask for far less pain relief than he was used to seeing. Now, specificity theory predicts a reasonably consistent linear relationship between pain and injury. A large injury should produce a large pain, a small injury, a smaller pain. And an injury in Boston that's comparable to an injury in France should basically produce roughly the same amount of pain. But Beecher noted that this relationship was breaking down in the hospital tents of World War II. So Beecher is walking through the killing fields of France, entering into the hospital tents, seeing soldiers with all kinds of serious injuries, and noting that they're not reporting as much pain as he would expect based on his experiences back in Boston, and noting that they're not asking for as much morphine as he would expect them to ask for based on his experiences back in Boston. Okay, so now find yourself a friend, somebody sitting next or near to you, and have a quick discussion. Why do you think the soldiers did not complain of as much about their pain as the civilians back in Boston? Give you a minute or two to think about that. Okay, so Dr. Beecher is noting that in the hospital tents of France, the soldiers don't seem to be complaining of as much pain as you would expect. They're not asking for as much pain relief as you would expect. Why might that be? What do you mean? Yeah, very good. Yeah, so you're in a war zone. Pain is going to be expected. You're going to get injured, quite likely. No shock, no surprise that happens. So maybe you're less inclined to complain about your pain because of that. Yeah, very good. Any other thoughts on why they might not have complained? Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that also often stated. Yeah. You're in a war zone. You're on high alert, a fight or flight kind of situation, and maybe that's not the right physiological state for your brain to allow pain to enter. Yep. Very good. Yep.
Okay, so the one will have higher threshold. It's because of how they perceive the pain also. Because like for me, my pain threshold, I can see the injury and get anxious about it. And I can feel, oh my God, I'm injured. And I make in my head, I make a perception that it's like hurting me. While other will be like, oh, it's fine. I can heal it. I can put it. The perception is more lenient about it.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so again, you're in a war zone. You get injured. It's not a huge surprise. You might expect that. Whereas if you're in a car accident, that is going to be a surprise. You don't expect to go and get injured on your commute to work. Plus, also the injury means something quite different, right? In a war zone, it means you're going to hospital. Not great, but possibly better than the front line, right? Nobody's going to shoot at you in the hospital. Nobody's trying to kill you once you get there. Yep, go on, one more.
No audience. There's no audience. So because there's no nurses or no family, so they cannot. Yeah.
That's a very good point. Yes. In fact, who is the audience in a hospital tent? Yeah, the other patients, right? And they're your comrades in arms. And one really strong reason why you might not want to complain of pain in a hospital tent is that, well, yeah, my injury's bad, but Jeff's is worse and Roger's is really bad. And you doctors and nurses are bloody busy. So how about you look after them and I'll suck it down. You might also not ask for pain relief for the same reason. You're in a war zone, presumably morphine's going to be in short supply. My injury is not that bad. I don't want to take it away from the people that really need it. So there are lots of reasons why in a war zone, you might not have this relationship between pain and injury, why it might break down. And lots of people picked at Beecher's study for all of these reasons for a long time. It was about 40 years later when Ron Malzak finally decided, you know what, why don't we just do the same kind of study in a civilian setting? So he went and sat in a South London accident emergency department, and as people came in, he just asked them, you know, are you in any pain? So people have been in car accidents, in accidents at work, maybe got involved in a bar fight. It does happen. And he just asked them, does it hurt? And in about 40% of cases, people who said, no, it doesn't hurt. Now, these guys are not in a war zone, and they were fully aware of their injury, and they were just as surprised as the researchers that they weren't feeling any pain. Malzak asked the doctors and nurses, what do you think is going on here? And the doctors and nurses said, well, they're just being stoic. And Malzak's like, I don't think so. I think they're really not feeling pain. And then he said, okay, well, what about the others? How do you assess their pain? And the doctors and nurses said, well, about 40% of them are really complaining rather too much of their pain based on their injuries. And in his report, Malzak said, it's a strange theory, the specificity theory, that can only account for 20% of the pain that we see. 80% we get wrong based on specificity theory. And as it happens, it's not just these acute chronic injuries that don't seem to correlate with pain in the way that we expect, but also more chronic long-term injuries or pathologies. When we first started being able to take images of backs with x-rays, we expected we'd start to see the causes of pathology, the causes of back pain and joint pain. It didn't quite work out, but x-rays aren't brilliant. And along came the MRI scanner. MRI scans give us exquisite structural images of backs and joints. And now we thought, for sure, this is going to show us what it is that's causing joint pain and causing back pain. But that didn't pan out either. So if you go and see your doctor and your doctor says you've got a disc bulge, that might sound pretty bad. But as it happens, if you don't have a disc bulge, you're a statistical anomaly. By the time you get into your 50s, almost everybody has a disc bulge. There's no clear association of disc bulges with pain. Similarly with disc degeneration, about 80% of people when they get to their 50s have disc degeneration. Again, it doesn't show any clear relationship with pain. A disc protrusion is less common, but still not clearly associated with an experience of pain. If you haven't told you've got a meniscal abnormality in your knees, it sounds bad. But again, you're a statistical abnormality if you reach your 50s, and you don't have a meniscal abnormality in your knees. Same goes for a SLAP injury, which stands for superior lateral and posterior injury. It's the labral sac that gets injured, except it's not really injured because it's not clearly associated with any pain. And the same for a labral tear in your hip. You're an abnormality. If you don't have one, again, it's not clearly associated with any pain. If you take nothing else away from tonight, take this away. If you go and see your doctor and you have an MR scan or some other sort of scan of your insides, and they say, oh, I've spotted a tear, I've spotted a bulge, I've spotted this, that might be the cause of your pain, be very, very dubious and be very cautious before you go and have surgery to fix that, because there's a very strong chance that it has nothing at all to do with your pain. So this pain that occurs in the absence of an injury is a serious medical problem. More than 70% of all reports of low back pain have no demonstrable pathological cause. The things that we thought were pathological causes have turned out to not be the pathological causes that we expected. So in fact, 70% is very generous. It's probably closer to 90% of cases of back pain have no known underlying mechanical cause or functional cause for them. Degeneration of the lower back in subjects with pain is comparable to that of subjects without pain, as I've just shown you. We did a study in 2002, and we looked at patients with pain. We looked at younger controls without pain. We got radiologists to score their backs on the fantastic MR scans that we took of them. And it came back that the people with pain had better looking backs in better shape than the people without pain. And we speculated that that's probably because the people in pain were looking after their backs and not using them as much as the young controls who didn't have any pain. So they weren't causing the wear and tear. That is a normal thing that happens. This lack of pathology to account for pain is characteristic of the so-called functional disorders. What are the functional disorders? Anything that's got idiopathic in the title, anything that's got atypical in the title, anything that's got syndrome in the title is often a functional disorder. We've used various different terms over the years: psychosomatic, patients don't like it, so we move on; mechanical, patients don't like it, so we move on; functional, patients don't like that, we're probably going to move on to something else. It doesn't really matter what you call it. The hallmark of it is that you have a underlying pain experience that we can't find any cause for. That's a functional disorder. So my PhD began in the 1990s, and it began with a very straightforward idea that if the problem isn't in your back or in your joints, then maybe it's in your brain or it's in your psyche or both. And that's what I spent a good 20, 30 years pursuing. And I pursued this in common with a lot of people who are pursuing a similar idea about all psychiatric disorders. As I say, this began in the late 80s, early 90s. And this paper caught my eye. It came out a couple of years ago, and it caught my eye because the senior author on this paper was Ray Dolan. And Ray Dolan was one of my mentors when I was doing my PhD. I was doing my PhD at the cyclotron unit in the Hammersmith Hospital. And the director of the unit was a very flamboyant, very extrovert, fantastic guy called Richard Verkowiak. And he was an intensely competitive man. And we were in competition with the St. Louis group in America. They would publish a paper, we would trash it. We would publish a paper, they would trash it. That's the way the game went. And every time the St. Louis group published a paper, Richard would run out of his office in a fury and start banging on all the doors down the corridor. And he'd burst in and he'd say, "Come on, hurry up. You've got to scan more people. In 5-10 years' time, we're going to know what causes depression. It's going to be cured. If you don't get there, the St. Louis group will get there. We've got to scan more people with anxiety. In 10 years' time, we're going to cure anxiety. Same for schizophrenia, same for autism. And Stuart, same for functional pain. Get your patients in the scanner." And Ray Dolan would always follow Richard along for these journeys, and he'd stand behind and going, "Come on, Stuart, hurry up, you know, tick tock, tick tock." And we believed this. We really genuinely believed that we had the technology that was going to resolve these problems in the next decade or so. So when this paper came out from Ray calling for neuroimaging and psychiatry in the case of failing better, I thought, well, I've got to pay attention to this. What is Ray saying here? And this is the key part of the summary. From the early 1990s, non-invasive functional neuroimaging, coupled with parallel developments in the cognitive neurosciences, seemed to signal a new era of neurobiologically grounded diagnosis and treatment in psychiatry. Yet, despite 3 decades of intense neuroimaging research, we still lack a neurobiological account for any psychiatric condition. A not great situation for 4 decades worth of work. And in the body of the paper, Ray is even more dour. Casting a cold eye on the psychiatric neuroimaging literature invites a conclusion that despite 30 years of intense research and considerable technological advances, this enterprise has not delivered a neurobiological account, i.e. a mechanistic explanation for any psychiatric disorder, nor has it provided a credible imaging-based biomarker of clinical utility. We haven't moved the needle forward, says Professor Dolan, and I think in that he is actually correct. So you may have heard about this problem through the failed serotonin hypothesis or through the discussion that's exploded over the last couple of years about depression not being the result of a chemical imbalance. For decades, we told patients that depression is a result of chemical imbalance, and we stopped rather abruptly about 2 years ago in large response to this review from Joanna Moncrief, also from the same London group that Ray is a part of. And they looked at all the evidence associating serotonin with an experience of depression and found it all wanting. I can put you on a tryptophan-reduced diet, which will reduce your levels of serotonin. Most of you will not get depressed. I can put you on antidepressants, and most of you will not get happier. And if you do, you'll get happier long after your serotonin levels have gone up. If you're born with a certain type of phenotype that means you don't produce as much serotonin, you're no more likely to be depressed than people who are not born with that phenotype, and so on and so forth. And this may come as quite a shock because you'll be used to seeing images like this that show the depressed brain clearly different from the not depressed brain. And we were told for a long time that this depressed brain is a result of a lack of serotonin or a lack of active serotonin that caused the lack of activity. And so if you take drugs to replace the serotonin, then you'll become not depressed. Prozac being the most famous of all the serotonin replacement therapies, the first designer drug for a psychiatric problem invented in the 1980s. And many doctors in response to Moncrief's paper said, well, okay, maybe we don't know exactly how it is that serotonin is involved in depression, but we do kind of know it is because antidepressants like Prozac work. But that's at least an exaggeration or an overstatement. This is Irving Kirsch, who about 20 years ago went to the FDA and said, can I have all the data associated with every trial that's ever been done in the United States using antidepressants versus a placebo? And the FDA said, yes, glad you asked, because that's why we force every company in the United States to give us all their data so that good people like you can trawl through it and see what's really happening. And what Kirsch demonstrated in this rather complicated graph is that if you are very depressed, if you're at the very high end of the depression spectrum, then you will get a clinical benefit, or on average, you'll get a clinical benefit from antidepressants. But if you are in the moderate to mild range of depression, you get no benefit at all. And most people who are taking antidepressants are indeed in that range. So it's true that very severely depressed people will benefit or should benefit from antidepressants. But outside of that, very little benefit. And the situation with pain is much, much worse. The drugs for pain have done considerable harm. Most of you, I'm sure, will have heard of the opioid crisis. If you haven't, or if you have and you're interested in it, I do strongly recommend this book, The Right to Pain Relief by Mark Sullivan and Jane Ballantyne. It gives an excellent account of the opioid crisis. In the 1990s, we believed that opioids would allow patients with chronic pain to live pain-free lives. We believe that in the same way that antidepressants can leave depressed patients to live happier lives, opioids can lead pain patients to live lives with less pain. And we believe this in part in response to the hospice movement. The hospice movement had demonstrated very clearly that the use of opioids at the end of life meant that people didn't have to die in pain. And the argument was made, well, if people don't need to die in pain, why should they live in pain? Why not use opioids for people who are younger who are not at the end of life? The obvious answer to that is, well, what about addiction? But we had an answer for that too. We said, well, addiction only happens when people are trying to escape their lives. But pain patients are not trying to escape their lives, they're trying to live their lives. It wasn't a completely bonkers argument. Many veterans came back from Vietnam with a rampant opioid addiction. 90% or more of them got off their opioids once they left the war environment. So there was at least some evidence that what we were saying was true. But we were clearly very wrong. The opioid crisis has claimed the lives of over 500,000 Americans and costs around $1 trillion a year, even to today. Okay, so what is the mistake that we're making? It's not easy to understand the kind of mistake we might be making. So I'm going to illustrate it with a fun, slightly silly, but I think a fun illustration. So tears of grief, you will find, have a higher manganese content than do tears from irritation. So if you're chopping an onion, you cry. If you're going to a funeral, you cry. If you collect your tears, people have done this, that's how we know, and measure the manganese content of the tears of grief will have more manganese in them than the tears of irritation. And I think this is fantastic research. I think we should study tears. It's good fun. Let's find out what's going on with tears. But, oops, what happened? Sorry. But if you were to try and cure grief by reducing the manganese content of tears, then surely you're making some kind of mistake. And the really interesting thing is that I think it might actually work. I think if you reduce the manganese content of tears or gave somebody a drug that did that before they went to a funeral, they might experience less grief. But you would still be making a mistake to try and understand grief in that way. Obviously, the manganese content of tears is somehow involved in the causal chain that is grief. Otherwise, the manganese content of tears wouldn't be higher, right? And if you change it, it's not impossible that you might alter somebody's grief. But we would, most of us think that's not a good way of dealing with grief, that there's some sort of error going on there. If you've read Brave New World, in Brave New World, everybody takes Soma. Soma basically helps everybody enjoy their lives despite the circumstances. And it's dystopian and it's appalling and we don't like it. It's the same kind of thing if you were to try and give someone a manganese-reducing drug to deal with their grief. Okay, so all of this is great fun. It's interesting, but there's another giant in the world of mental health, Tom Insel, who also did a sudden mea culpa. Tom Insel was the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health for 13 years, and then he left abruptly and joined Alphabet, the parent company of Google. And in an interview, this is how he explained why he did it. I spent 13 years at NIH, really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded in getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large cost, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, or improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. Again, a real statement, a real mea culpa that we're not making progress. So what does it mean to say that depression or pain is not caused by a chemical imbalance? It's not neurochemical. It's not involved neurophysiology. It's not neurophysiology that's causing it. Well, it doesn't mean that the brains of people who are depressed are going to look the same as the brains of people who are not depressed. It doesn't mean the brains of people who are in pain are going to look the same as the brains of people who are not in pain. That can't be true. It doesn't mean that depression and pain have no physical basis. What it means is that the chemical imbalance is more a condition than a cause, in the same way that manganese content of tears are more a condition than a cause of grief. Instead of the cause being a chemical imbalance, perhaps the cause is a psychological imbalance. Everybody faces problems in their life, economic circumstances that you don't like, a job that you don't enjoy, and a relationship that's abusive, and whatever it might be. And if you don't respond to that in the correct way, then you may become depressed. And the same argument can be made about chronic pain. So the best statement of this hypothesis I've seen recently comes from the very difficult to pronounce Skamvugaras's group. They've published this paper, Functional Logical Disorders, challenging the mainstream agnostic causative position. Not the most user-friendly of titles. What they're basically saying is that even though everybody keeps saying that, you know, it isn't serotonin that causes this, it isn't dopamine that causes this, it isn't that causes this, we still accept that the brain is really the causal agent in all the functional disorders. And they think Skamvugaras and his group are saying, no, that's incorrect. We must eliminate that hypothesis. Instead, we must turn to the psychological causation model. The psychological causation model of functional disorders proposes that these conditions occur when different forms of psychological or psychiatric distress are non-consciously and involuntarily expressed as physical symptoms and signs. The physical manifestations may appear to be the result of a general medical condition, but thorough assessment shows them to be medically unexplained. And so the real causal agent is not the brain, but the psychological processing that requires a brain, but isn't the same thing. Okay, let me give you an illustration of how this might happen in the world of pain. And I'm going to show you here is a paper, the entire paper that appeared in the British Medical Journal back in 1995, including the illustration, which is the boot with a nail through it. And I've broken the paper into 2 paragraphs for dramatic impact, but in the actual paper, it's just 1 paragraph. So here's my first paragraph. A builder, aged 29, came to the accident emergency department, having jumped down onto a 15-centimeter nail. As the smallest movement of the nail was painful, he was sedated with fentanyl and midazolam. The nail was then pulled out from below. And you can probably guess what's coming, but it's still hilarious. When his boot was removed, a miraculous cure appeared to have taken place. Despite entering proximal to the steel toe cap, the nail had penetrated between the toes. The foot was entirely uninjured. Okay, so to give you a short break from my voice, have another quick discussion. Do you think we should believe that the builder really felt the pain that he reported? I'll give you 30 seconds or so to think about that. Okay, so the builder jumps down onto a nail. It goes straight through his boot, straight through his toes, no injury whatsoever, no tissue is damaged. He screams out in pain, so much so that he's taken to hospital, he's sedated, he's calmed down, the boot is removed, and then the truth is revealed. Was he in pain? Should we believe him? Yes, lots of yeses. Anybody want to say why yes? Yes, you're going for yes. Anybody going to go for no? Okay, now everybody believes him. All right, very good. Yes. Okay, so we should believe him because, generally speaking, we should believe our patients when they tell us they're in pain. There's no particular reason to expect that, lots of people are telling lies when they turn up at hospital. But also, I think we should really believe him because, building sites in most countries are quite macho places. Construction jobs are highly sought after in most countries. I realize Singapore's slightly odd in that regard, but in many countries, construction jobs are well paid and they're reasonably well skilled. They're prestigious jobs and you are expected to work very hard. And if you show any sign of weakness, you're going to be mercilessly attacked. I can only imagine how much fun they made of this poor guy when it was revealed that the boot had taken the nail and his foot had not. In fact, I imagine they're still making fun of him to this day, and he really, really wishes he'd never said anything when he jumped down onto that nail. So we can believe that he really felt pain, and he illustrates that presumably psychological mechanisms really can generate pain in the absence of any underlying tissue damage or disease. So we decided, well, inspired by our friend who jumped down on a nail, we're going to try and generate pain in people without touching them. Touching is cheating. And the way in which we did this was that we took highly hypnotizable people, we hypnotized them, and we delivered noxious heat to them half the time. But half the time, we told them we're delivering noxious heat, but we delivered nothing at all, and they still reported an experience of pain, a hallucinated pain, if you will. And when we looked at their brain activity, we were very excited because the brain activity in response to the hallucinated pain, very similar to the activity in response to the physically induced pain. There's more activity for the physically induced pain, but they reported more pain, so that made sense. But what's really important, is that the pattern of activity is very similar. So the thalamus is activated for the physically induced, also for the hallucinated. The anterior cingulate is activated for the physically induced, also for the hallucinated. Primary sensory cortex is activated for the hallucinated, not for the physically induced as it happens. I won't linger on that. Secondary somatosensory cortex in both, insula in both, prefrontal cortex in both. And we thought, yes, we have clearly demonstrated now that you can generate pain without injury. And we have clearly demonstrated that you can do that via a psychological mechanism. And we have clearly demonstrated that when that happens, it involves the same brain areas that we know are involved in physically induced pain. Now, all we have to do, Ray, we're almost there, is find drugs that knock out the key areas or behavioral techniques, psychological interventions that stop these areas being activated. This is probably the high point of my imaging career. If psychological dysfunction maintains chronic functional pain, then psychological therapy should relieve chronic functional pain at least reasonably well. And the long story short, it doesn't. Rather annoyingly, we've done many trials now of various psychological interventions for chronic pain. And if psychology matters as much as we think it does, then this intervention should reduce pain reasonably, perhaps even substantially, but they reduce it only minimally. So this is a review of 2,572 people involved in 29 different studies. The main treatment of intervention is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is very popular. It's definitely safer and better than opioids. It's used for a variety of problems, anxiety, depression, and pain. And when you compare cognitive behavioral therapy to treatment as usual, you do get a reduction in pain, but not a very big one. The mean pain intensity intervention groups was 0.22 standard deviations lower than the treatment as usual group. Now, I hate that psychologists and scientists do this. Why do we talk in such weird ways? Why don't we just give you real numbers? So let me translate that into real numbers. Most of the pain studies will rate pain from 0 to 100. 0, no pain, 100, maximum pain. Let's say we've got a group of people who have an average pain rating of 70, and 95% of people range between 50 and 90. That's a standard deviation of 20 on an average of 70. So a 0.22 standard deviation reduction means roughly a 5-point reduction in your pain. Now, 5 points can be a lot. If I took your IQ, the IQ in this room would average roughly 100. And if I took your IQ before this lecture and got an average of 100, I took your IQ after this lecture, got an IQ of 105, that'd be amazing. If I could keep doing that around the world, my life would be magnificent. I cannot do that. A 5-point change in IQ scores is enormous. But a 5-point change in pain scores is absolutely insignificant. Nobody will notice that their pain has dropped by 5 points on a 100-point scale. Broadly speaking, you need a 20 to 30-point drop for you to clearly notice that your pain has got better. And if we compare CBT to an active control, that's literally anything else psychologically related. So just giving you a lecture on pain, for example, would be a psychological treatment for pain. Then the results get even more puny. Anything compared to CBT, compared to anything, only gives you a 0.09 standard deviation change. And as the authors pointed out, CBT versus active control showed very small benefit at treatment end for pain, and the effects were not maintained at 3 to 6 months. So do absolutely anything for people, and 3 to 6 months later, it won't be any different from having done virtually nothing. And this is really, really disappointing, because while we've been messing around with all these brain scans and all these psychological interventions for pain, the problem of pain has not got better, it has got substantially worse. So here's an illustration of that worsening of pain. This is a group of people in the US Armed Forces, studied between 2009 and 2018. The gray line is pain that's people are consulting for pain where there's no known cause. So that's all the functional pains, essentially. And you can see that for all the pains where there is a known cause, there's no change in the prevalence of visits to medics for that pain. But for no known cause, there is almost a 5-fold increase in that 10-year period. And if you look around the world, at disability days lost to disability due to back pain. This graph shows the disability lost due to back pain in 1990 in pink and 2015 in blue, and all the blue bars are bigger than the pink bars. This graph is important because the bars are ages, so everybody says, well, of course pain is going up because people are getting older, and it's true, that is part of it. But in every single age group, apart from the 5 to 9-year-olds, there's an increase in the blue bars compared to the pink bars, including in the older groups. And that's also not accounted for in terms of population increase either. And the intensity of the pain in elderly groups has also been increasing. This is the average intensity reported in 1998 down there, 2010 at the right. There is a large amount of data demonstrating rising chronic pain since the 1990s. It's especially true in America, Western Europe, and Australia, but there's at least evidence of an increasing burden of global burden of back pain. It seems unlikely that it is our backs or indeed our brains that have been collapsing over this period. So what on earth is it that is happening? So now we move into the really hard part of the lecture. So we go back to this. Remember, Descartes implies that everything that's important about pain takes place within the confines of your body. Nothing else matters. Certainly, our experiences are dependent upon bodily processes. If you didn't have a sensory apparatus, you wouldn't feel anything. Heads full of sawdust don't feel anything. Bodies without nociceptors don't feel pain. So you do need a body, you do need a brain. But our experiences also cohere within a framework of understanding that puts our senses into context, that allows them the right place, that provides them with meaning. And so I think pain is a product of mechanisms in the body, but also a product of meanings. Mechanisms in the body don't seem to be delivering an understanding of pain, and so we must turn to examine meaning. Okay, let me try and illustrate what I mean by this with some hokey examples. What do you see here? Not a trick question. Everybody's too frightened. It's too obvious, right? Okay. Yeah, you're overcomplicating it. Yeah. Okay. So most people say they see a black patch on a white background, right? That's what you see. I need to come up with an easier black patch on a white background. A black patch on a white background, however, already goes beyond what's there. Because what's there is just black and white. There's no patch, there's no foreground, there's no background, there's just different intensities of light streaming out from the screen. So we are extracting or making the foreground and background. There's no foreground and background in the light per se. Perception is like that. We highlight some aspects of the world, we cover up other aspects of it. We tend to go beyond the mere sensation that would just dissolve us into the surface appearances of the world. This is another way of illustrating this. So what do you see? Oops, what do you see here in yellow? Vase, very good. What do you see here? Two faces, very good. Okay, but if you look at the yellow vase and focus your attention carefully, you can probably pull the faces out either side of it. And if you look at the white vase, and sorry, if you look at the black faces and you focus very carefully again, you can probably pull the vase out as well, right? Now, obviously, we don't consciously and actively do this all the time. If we had to do it do perception like that, it'd be exhausting. Most of the time we do just perceive. But this at least illustrates that where you focus your attention, where you put your effort, can change under these circumstances what it is that you are experiencing. What I would say is that even if we're not consciously and actively doing it, the world is ambiguous. The world of sensation is ambiguous, and we've always got to untangle that ambiguity. So let me illustrate that with this famous illusion. Which line is longer? Both the same, because you're all intensely intelligent and bright group and know the trick already. But okay, so which line looks longer? The one on the bottom, right? Okay, so you all know this trick. The one on the bottom looks longer, but we all know that it is not longer. They are both exactly the same size. Perceptual truth is not physical truth. So the two straight line and the Muller-Lyrå optical illusion here, they're neither of equal or unequal length in perception. It's only in the objective world that the question of equal and unequal arises. If we merely sense the two straight lines, then they would be sensed as equal, right? Because they are equal. But we don't sense, we perceive. And perception goes beyond mere sensation. As I said before, perception means highlighting, covering up aspects of the world and seeing in context. The reason we see this line as being larger, there's lots of arguments about precisely why it is, but the one that I think has most traction is because the object in total is larger. And the object in total being larger gives you a context where you can see the line as being longer than it truly is, or longer than the other one is. Here's another illustration of the same sort of idea. Here you will see a field of tulips spreading out into the distance, some trees and a mountain. But of course, this is a 2D image, and the 2D image is colorful. There is no depth in the image, and there are no tulips in the image exactly. But you see the bunching up of the tulips, and you infer depth from it, and you see it in depth, not as what it truly is, which is just a 2D array of colored shapes. And so here, the story now starts again. And at this point, my students really hate me because this is about week 8. The end is in sight, and now we're beginning all over again. Our biology sensory apparatus cooperates with the outside world so that we see, we hear, we smell, we taste, and feel. If we didn't have a sensory apparatus, we couldn't do those things. So it's a necessary part of the story. But our sensory apparatus, if you think about it, it's only likely to deliver punctate experiences, the redness of red, the noisiness of noise, the smelliness of a smell, the atoms of experience, so to speak. And they're just going to pile up on top of each other or just follow each other one after another after another. And what we want to do is cohere things into objects, into continuous experiences. How on earth do we do that? How are those punctate, fleeting sensations cohered into a unified perception with all the right sensations held together and all the wrong ones kept apart? I don't blend, I don't think, into this shirt. You see me as separate from the shirt, but you could easily blend me into it as well, and where I touch the shirt and maybe even where I don't. And you can do this trick for yourself with every object you see on the way home and blend everything in and out of each other. And the sounds too. Why do you associate the sound of my voice with the movement of my mouth? Now, you don't have to do that, right? But you do it. How is it that we keep the right things together and the wrong things apart? Okay, so one argument I have is that we don't do this automatically. We think we do it automatically, and okay, let me qualify. Most of the time you do it automatically now, but you didn't come into the world doing it automatically. And we used to think that you did. We used to think that you came into the world able to see, able to hear, able to hold the right things together, keep the wrong things apart. That is until we started studying people who had cataracts at birth and then later in life had them fixed. When cataract operations became possible in the 1950s and 1960s, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s who'd been blind from birth started to receive cataracts so that they could see. And we expected they'd be able to see the world in the same way that you can, maybe a few days to recover, but they'd be able to see the world in the same way. And we were wrong. Now, if you think about it, a visual scene is quite complicated. So you pick out the girl dancing and the guy playing the bagpipes readily. You pull out the forms like this. But imagine if you focus instead on the hues and the luminescences in here. Well, this is what it would look like, and that'd be pretty damn confusing. So the patients were given very simple tasks to do after their cataracts had healed. And they were asked, and for each of these, how many objects do you see? And here, can you trace the long curve? They couldn't trace the long curve. And they reported a bewildering number of objects in response to these images. Patients reported seeing up to 9 objects in this image. You see 1 cube. It is obvious to you that it is 1 cube, but that's because you know automatically how to put the right bits together and keep the right bits in the right place. But the patients looked at that and were confused by the different luminescences, the different surfaces, the different edges, and they came up with up to 9 different objects that they were seeing. They couldn't just see the world in the way that you do. So we learn to integrate scenes into separate coherent objects. We forget that we've learned that, and instead we take vision for granted. But I can illustrate it for you with a simple task that's quite good fun, and this is almost bringing us to the end. So what do you hear? Anybody hear anything? Most people report they hear bird song, whistles, that kind of thing. Okay, now listen to this.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
And now you hear the camel.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
Let's do one more. You get better at these, apparently, the more you do them. Okay, one more go.
The police returned to the museum.
All right, there we go. Police returned to the museum.
Police returned to the museum.
All right, what do you see here? Well done. So you found the horse. First you see rocks and snow, but then you start to see horses. You probably pull out the one in the middle. Yeah, there we go. There's a face. There's another face. There's a foal down here. There's another horse back here hiding. I'm told there's up to 9 horses in there. I've only ever been able to find 6. So, and where the other 3 are hiding. Okay. What's this? No, yeah. All right. So what's the moral here? The moral here is the sensory information is not changing. The sine wave sound is exactly the same every single time you hear it, but your perceptual experience changes. The frog is there when you first see it, but you don't pull the frog out until you see the frog. The sensory information isn't changing. The physics isn't changing. You are changing. And your change allows you to see what was always there, but not apparent to you before. And I think the same is true to an extent with pain experience as well. Okay, I'm going to have to go really fast because I'm at the end of my hour. But philosophers do this thing where we tend to split the person from the object and put them in different places. We're in the same world. Objects and persons are in the same world, and we explore objects in the same true world. The object and the person are different facets of the world that you're in. We understand that as we pursue our understanding of objects by exploring them, examining them, and so on, we learn more about the object. That's obvious, right? What's less obvious is that we're also developing the criteria for understanding. We're learning what it is to learn when we explore the world around us. And what that means is the way in which you experience the world after you've learned something about it is going to be different than how you experienced it before you learned about it. That's a developmental process. You go through that in childhood. It's also a historical process. We've gone through that historically. We've developed all kinds of tools, conceptual and physical, for understanding the world around us. We construct tools, conceptual and physical, to engage the world, to help us to understand and cohere the world. In that way, we learn about objects, but we're also learning about learning. We're changing what it is to know and feel historically and developmentally as we learn about the world. And I think this applies to pain too. So if you go back 3 million years ago, the first hominids, the first animals, and all animals probably today, the way in which they experience pain is as a direct response to injury through their sensory receptors. The accompanying pain experience to injury is a command for action: move and protect. It has no broader meaning, no purpose to it. It is what it is because it is, and that's the end of it. But then, as we develop the ability to separate pain from other sensations, to preferentially attend to pain, we probably historically had to learn to do that. Then we entered into the realm where we can now suffer because we can perseverate on our pain. But at least until about the 1500s, that suffering had some redemptive meaning. Pain was a punishment that was worth enduring. It was a punishment for the fall. Almost every religion has that aspect to it. And what you suffered in this world, you would be redeemed in the next one for. So it gave it at least some reason to deal with it. But the emergence of the scientific age means that at least some pains can now be avoided, and that undermines the necessity of endurance and encourages a more utilitarian approach to pain. Human beings are those kinds of creatures that pursue pleasure and which avoid pain. And this also raises the idea that your pain can and should be reduced to zero, which is one of the roots, I think, of the problem that we face with pain. And very broadly, this means that absolutely everything now matters, which is frustrating for you and for my students and for everybody. And really broad brush, the 20th century weighs heavy on us. It was not the greatest of centuries, multiple wars, revolutions that ended in disaster. And we've stumbled out of the 20th century running somewhat out of steam. The grand collective projects, that period is over. How we move into the future is cast into doubt. How we cohere with each other is cast into doubt. The conventional moral norms that centered around loyalty to church, nation, family, solidarity with family man, all were substantially weakened during the 20th century. Families don't stay together. The church has been called into disrepute. Solidarity with your fellow man is difficult after the Holocaust, after the nuclear bombings, after the fire bombings of Dresden, Japan, and so forth. And so we look for new sources of social cohesion. And health and safety is a brilliant one. Who can be against health and safety? It's a good thing, right? And we can bring people together around the idea that we should be healthy and we should be safe. And we have saturated our environment with images and memes associated with health and safety. If you look around Singapore, you're seeing more and more of these. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into this in detail. I think one of the things that we've done is we've somewhat undermined resilience. A number of authors are pointing this out. Haidt and Luckenoff have pointed it out with respect to American college campuses, but it's spread more broadly into society. We have groups of people who organize themselves around their experience of PTSD, around their experiences of diabetes, around their anorexia, and so on and so forth. And nothing illustrated this more clearly to me than the incident with Simone Biles. Simone Biles pulled out of the 2020 Olympics because of concerns about her mental health. Now, the Olympics is all about putting your body on the line. It's all about doing stupid things, jumping higher than you should, running faster than you should, picking up things that are heavier than you should pick up, and so on and so forth. And Biles was not wrong to pull out because, you know, she faced some quite serious problems. But our response to it was interesting. We celebrated this response. It was the right thing to do, and other athletes should do the same thing. This is Sophie Scholl. Sophie Scholl led the resistance against Hitler in the 1930s and 1940s. In 1943, she was captured and she was hung. On the day that she was executed, she was 21 years old. And she said, "It's a fine day, but I must go. But what does my life matter if my death inspires thousands of people to rise up and prevent the ongoing oppression?" We, I think, understand Simone Biles' reluctance to put her body on the line more than we understand Sophie Scholl's putting her life on the line. We are culturally, I think, more comfortable with Biles than we are with Sophie Scholl. So to close, NUS is part of a project to improve the health of the 5,000 plus Queenstown residents. Anybody here from Queenstown? No? Okay, very good. It's all right, you don't have to be. As part of the initial assessment, the residents there rated their bodily pain from 1 to 6 over the past 4 weeks. So 1, no pain, 2, very mild pain, 3, mild, 4, moderate, 5, severe, 6, very severe. Of those aged 65 and over, 16% reported moderate to very severe pain. Of those aged 64 and below, 9% reported moderate to very severe pain. These are intensely low numbers. I mean, if you could create these numbers in New York City, in London, in Sydney, in almost any other country that I've worked in, you'd be an absolute hero to get numbers that low. What do you think is going to happen to the numbers of people with moderate to severe pain as the project focusing on residents' holistic well-being progresses? I'll leave the question rhetorical to protect the innocent. But I fear that the numbers are going to increase. And it won't be because their bodies are going to start collapsing or because the good people of Queenstown are going to start malingering and pretending they got pain. No, that's not what's going to cause it. It'll be because the effort to improve health is going to undermine the acceptance of pain in some way. They're going to learn that pain is something bad that you shouldn't put up with. So in conclusion, today, there's a prevalent form of subjectivity that's concerned with safety and well-being. It tends to be fearful, passive, inward-looking. It's not surprising, given the events of the 20th century, that we came out in this way, but that's the prevalent subjectivity. And an understanding of pain as a part of life, as something that can be instructive or at least managed or ignored without consequence, is less socially acceptable today than perhaps it was 30, 40 years ago. It's less a part of our cultural understanding. Instead, pain is more readily understood as a threat that the medical establishment, government, society, all of us should fully engage with. But fully engagement with pain means more pain-related fear and anxiety. Full engagement with pain means more pain-related disability. Full engagement with pain, I think, just means more pain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a very engaging session, I have my phone with me because there's some questions on Zoom. Excuse me. But we also have an opportunity to have some questions from the floor. So let me start by inviting our guests in the room with us. Do you have any questions? Could you raise your hand? Can I just ask one favor? We have a couple of mic runners around. Please use the microphone when asking a question. Could you state your name, where you're from, and use the mic? Because otherwise our friends in Zoom can't hear you no matter how loud you are. So we have the lady here, followed by the lady. Can we take two back to back? Yeah, so the two ladies.
Hello, my name is Rashi. So my question is, so for example, on a scale, if we put placebo effect, phantom limb and phobias. So your phantom limb is something more biological that your brain compensate for. Your placebo effect is in the middle, like the brain and the psychology will help, while the phobias are more psychological. So, like, if I'm my very humble understanding, so if I see like that, what on what way you'll will put this perception of pain? So, is it like more like, because if though my second question in that is, because if there's induced phobias and there is a lot of treatment available in therapies, and if it's more psychological in that way, like perception of pain, it's very remarkable that we don't find any helpful data for that, while in phobias the therapies and CBT especially has shown miraculous results. Yes.
So, and Marianne, could we get a mic here, please? For the lady in the front.
Oh, thank you. Okay, this is like, I'm not sure this is too true, but like I think in like romantic relationships, like when you have been like dumped or like broken up with someone, I think there's some like research saying that the pain of losing that romantic partner or someone close to you doesn't have to be like a breakup, is equivalent to like physical pain. So do you think like there'll be like more research in that direction? Like how come people can feel emotional pain as much as physical pain? Is there like a mind-body connection to it? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So thanks for those questions. Great questions. So you chose very carefully, right? So phantom limb pain, I wouldn't include it as a functional pain, and the reason for that is that functional pain is where there's no underlying reason for the pain, and with phantom limb, there's clearly is an underlying. You've lost a limb, right? Now it is a strange one because you feel pain in a limb that you don't have, and how does that work? But there are decent physiological mechanisms that can explain that, so I wouldn't put it in the same category. You also chose very carefully from the psychiatric literature as well. So phobias, yes, if you have a fear of spiders or whatever it is, we can help you with those. You know, there are some very good behavioral therapies, desensitization therapies that generally speaking do work and will get you over your phobia. So you've cheated. The better comparison is between something like, say, fibromyalgia, where a person feels bruised all over. There's no underlying reason for it. We can find no injury, no disease process that accounts for this. It is just a disease defined by the subjectivity. And that's very similar to depression, which is the same problem, where there are correlates, right? There always will be. It has to have a basis in material reality of the body, but we can't find what are the causal mechanisms. And for those kinds of diseases, we haven't, as Ansel pointed out, we haven't moved the needle forward in the last 50 years. And that's it's the underlying tragedy of the psychiatric world that we haven't made progress on those kinds of things. To come to your question, I'm actually responsible for some of that research, so it's my fault. I would walk back from it now. There was a mania during the 1990s, early 2000s for trying to say that everything that basically affects you negatively is kind of like pain. And we did a series of studies where we showed people images of other people being injured, and videos of people being injured. And people with bad backs, particularly if they watch somebody do a bad lift, they'll say, "Oh, that hurts my back." So there's something definitely in it. And about 30% of people, if they see someone else being injured, will go, "Oh, that kind of hurt me too." But nobody ever gets confused about the pain of a broken heart and the pain of a heart attack. Everybody knows that those are very clearly different. They feel very different. So there's overlap for sure, but qualitatively, they're very, very different things.
Thank you. Before I go to the Zoom questions, do we have any questions in the room? Can probably take another one or two from the room before we move to Zoom. Sir, you have a question over there?
Hi, Bob. We met we met earlier just now. My name is Michael. Okay, I explained I had went for brain tumor operation. I do know quite well on pain management, you see, but I just want to know is that pain is it a psychological things where you actually endure pain? Technically, firstly, you feel very painful when you during the duration of pain, you're able to endure and you adaptability to it, and then eventually, no pain. Is it part of a psychological or chemical exchange in the brains or whatever? See, and sorry, second question is that is going forward, are we going AI to collaborate with all these technological things in the new world of treatments of pain management? See, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, good.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for your question. I think the spirit of your question is that, well, maybe sometimes pain clearly has some sort of underlying biochemical neurological cause. And I think, yeah, that is true. If you hit your hand with a hammer, it's blindingly obvious why your hand hurts, right? And it is because the nociceptors are screaming, all the pain fibers are active, parts of your brain are screaming out an experience of pain. But once you get past that acute stage, then you're in the realm where it becomes much less clear what is causal and what is effect. All pain is essentially psychological, even if you hit your hand with a hammer, right? It's not your hand that hurts. You can chop your hand off and throw it across the room, and you might still feel it. It's the brain that is generating the experience of pain. It's the brain where is the necessary substrate of an experience of pain. But once you get into that chronic era, that chronic period, then it becomes much less clear what it is that's maintaining the experience of pain. And I used the example of the manganese content of tears. I think it's an illustrative one because even grief has some sort of physiological underpinning to it. Must do, right? Manganese is involved in it, but we don't think grief is caused exactly by an excess of manganese. We wouldn't take manganese reduction pills to get rid of our grief. And I think the same kind of thing is working with pain. It's just that we don't have such a good understanding of what the psychological and sociological mechanisms of pain precisely are. And then what was your second question again? Oh, yes, AI. Yeah, yeah. So that was Thomas Insel joined Alphabet because he basically thinks that that's what's going to resolve the problem of mental health. It's going to be in the world of big data and the world of AI. And I think that's just going to be just as disappointing as the functional imaging period, but we will see. But my prediction, you heard it here first, it ain't going to work.
A quick one, sir. A quick one, please.
Not being racial, the amazing part of the Indians and the Chinese, they can walk on the fire. How does they do it? Is it a mental brain strong or whatever? You know, just let you know, I might hope learn to master that. Thank you.
There are many different answers to that question. It still remains somewhat mysterious. There are arguments that there's something to do with the moisture that exists on your feet that creates a barrier between you and the hot coals. There's some arguments that it's the speed at which you traverse it. I don't have a good answer to that, but you can definitely overcome any noxious event through your own force if you want to. I'm not incidentally advocating that. My position is not one of you just need to get over your pain. I think that's a really bad position. In fact, that throws you back onto your own personal resources, which I think is part of the problem. We're thrown back on our own personal resources way too much in attempts to deal with pain, and none of us are strong enough to do that. We need the help of each other to get through our pain problems and indeed our mental health problems more broadly.
Thank you. I think just quickly to your point, maybe they do feel pain, but they see it as something towards something greater, because it's not just a racial thing, it's a religious thing. People do that not because they believe that leads to a better future, a happier afterlife. But coming to a point that was raised in the Q&A in Zoom, I think my fund asked the question, why do you think that the self-reporting of pain, especially in your Queenstown study, in Singapore is so much lower than in other countries? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I don't have the answer, right? So it's part of my aim is to try to find out the answer without making it worse. I want to tread very, very carefully through the Queenstown project. But my hunch is that you haven't yet been through the experience that we've been through in the West. So you're doing it. You know, you're making lots more noise about mental health problems in Singapore. You're raising awareness. I think those are potentially bad things. Again, you heard it here first. Stigma isn't entirely a bad thing. We should have a certain amount of pride in being healthy and well. You know, those are good things. So a certain expectation that you be well and you be, you know, able, I think is not a bad thing to have. Not too much. Don't want people to be feeling bad about, you know, having an actual health problem, but a certain general cultural expectation that you'll be healthy is not a bad expectation. And I think awareness campaigns can undermine that. I also think your history, you know, the fact that you've been thrust into independence in 1965. So if you came to adulthood in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you were involved in a nation building project. Those are great projects to be involved in. You can see the fruits of your labor everywhere you look. You can see the progress that you've made. You can take pride in what has happened. That's great meaning building stuff that makes you, I think, broadly more resilient. So those are my sort of back of the envelope takes on it, but I don't know for sure, and I want to, like I said, I want to find out without screwing you up.
So I think building on that point, there's an interesting question from Joel on Zoom, and Joel's asking, how do we account for, especially in medical systems, these cultural differences, right? So you mentioned that, you know, a generation, I think what in Singapore would be a generation of great men and women who brought us through independence, third world, the first world, and their perceptions of resilience, their perceptions of difficulty or challenges is quite different. And how do we account for that sort of cultural differences when clinically trying to understand pain?
Yeah, so perhaps I'll spin the question slightly differently. I think the fact that there are cultural differences in the expression of pain and cultural differences in the amount of pain-related disability that we see emphasizes that pain isn't just within the confines of somebody's body. It emphasizes that pain does stretch out into the broader community, that there is a genuine cultural, sociological, psychological component to pain that is necessary if we want to have a full understanding of pain. I'd put it like that.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, see, technology doesn't work very well for me. Ladies and gentlemen, do we have more questions from the room? I'm also keeping an eye on the time. I think we can do a quick round of questions from the audience before we quickly have to wrap up today's session. So, do you have any more questions from the room? Really? Everybody's happy, no pain. Oh, now suddenly everyone's happy. So I see 3 questions. Let's quickly try. Each of you, please keep your questions brief, and we'll try to take all 3 questions. Thank you.
I actually have this question, Prof, about you have been using the word perception a lot, about perception. So how can we improve our perception such that, you know, just like the people in the army, right? They're all feeling the pain, but because of their acceptance of the situation, the perception of pain, they were suffering less. Because I do remember reading an article somewhere about this gentleman who actually took people through a study where he showed them a picture of their pain, and they had the picture, that particular image getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and they actually started feeling less pain. So is there something that's being done to do this thing now?
Sir, could we have your question? Just in front of you. Right in front of you.
Thank you. After going through this hour, I'm not sure about pain, you know. Really? Yeah. Basically, If somebody tell me pain, say, I don't know, bullshit, you're thinking too much. But is there any way to really tell whether it is really pain or not?
Thank you. A last question for a young man.
All right.
Used to be working with us at the Head Foundation.
All right. Yes. So my question comes from my experience as a first responder a few years back. So why do some individuals report high levels of pain from seemingly minor injuries, while others report little to no pain from severe injuries?
Okay, so I'll take the questions in order. So broadly, you ask, can we help people, right? And the answer to that is sort of. So the experiment you described, there's lots of interventions like that. I can fairly confidently take somebody who's got a chronic pain problem, and if you put them in my lab for an hour, I can definitely get them to reduce their amount of pain. We can do that. The trouble is, it doesn't last. I mean, the hypnosis study was a great success, and we used hypnosis with patients, and we can get great control over their pain. But as soon as they walk out into the world, it will tend to come back, and that's a fairly clear problem. More generally, there is distinctly an association between a pain experience and its tendency to become chronic based on how the person interprets what is happening. So if you have a back pain, say, and you think, oh no, I'm going to end up in a wheelchair, I'm going to lose my job, I'm not going to be able to support my family, I'm not going to be able to go out anymore, I have to rest, I have to protect this. If you react in that way, then you're more likely to move towards a chronic disability than if you say, well, I can deal with this pain, my goals are bigger than it, and continue to operate in a normal way. So generally speaking, if we can get somebody and undermine those kinds of beliefs and undermine the behavioral patterns that are associated with an increase in pain, then we can improve you. The trouble is, that's a lot easier said than done, and we don't have a lot of success. And I think part of the reason we don't have success is because we do actually need some cultural help. We need to have a cultural expectation that you will get better, a cultural expectation that you will be able to sustain this injury and you'll be okay. And if we don't have that, then the culture is constantly pushing people towards that fear avoidance direction rather than towards the I can cope and I will recover direction. And that's where I think society and culture do matter. Can we ever measure pain in any kind of meaningful way? We argue about this a lot. Were the soldiers in World War II not experiencing pain, or were they just not reporting as much pain? And I don't know is the honest answer to that. What I can tell you is that generally speaking, brain activation correlates nicely with what people report as their experience of pain. So I have a reasonable amount of belief that if you say your pain is a 9 out of 10, it really is quite significant pain. And if you say it's 3 out of 10, it really is a mild pain based on the objective correlates that we do have that are associated with pain. It's not perfect. It'll never be perfect. I'm never going to have a painiometer that I can wave at you that will tell me exactly how much pain you experience. And then your question was, remind me. As a first responder, you've experienced people reporting pain, right? I think severe injuries. It's the same. Actually, it's the same answers to these two gentlemen. So you ever had a paper cut? Did it hurt? Yeah. Yeah, minor injury, right? Hurts like hell. So there is no clear one-to-one relationship between injury and pain that paper cuts nicely demonstrate. And even with a given injury in the same person, if they're in a good place, it might not hurt as much. The next day it might hurt more. Pain bounces and varies quite a lot. I would say it's not a personality thing. Many a PhD has gone to their grave trying to demonstrate that there are pain-prone people. There are no pain-prone people. We're all pain-prone and not pain-prone, broadly speaking, to the same kind of extent. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Stuart for what has been a very insightful and I hope painless hour in the house. So thank you very much, Stuart. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to end, but before we do, let me share a little bit about what we have lined up next month. So we have been talking a little bit about pain, but now let's move. And I'm sure if you talk to many entrepreneurs, they'll tell you they're in a lot of pain. But nonetheless, I think entrepreneurship education is something we're trying a lot across the world to tackle, to unpack in our education systems. So join us for this webinar, 25th of July,
3:30 to 5 p.m. So it's a bit more convenient. This is a fully online session. The QR code's there. Please join us. Please register. Those of you are online, thank you very much for joining us. And those of you in the room, thank you so much for choosing to spend your evening with the Head Foundation. Good night.